What's the difference between a lightly planted, a medium planted, and a heavily planted aquarium? We're going to talk about why that's important to know what you got and how it can help you in your journey in fish keeping. We'll talk about a few tanks that I have down here, guys, that are examples of each one of those things, okay? So let's get into talking about this tank first. So this is, of course, the Ancient Gardens remake. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this aquarium, but this is something that I would classify as a medium planted tank. I would also call the first tank here in the experiment series a medium planted tank as well. This guy up here I would refer to as somewhere between a lightly planted and medium planted tank. The Sand Waterfall Aquarium, which is looking a little beat up right now, we'll take a closer look later, but this would also be referred to as a lightly planted tank. When we come over and take a look at the Guppy Wine Glass, I would call this a heavily planted tank. And likewise for our CO2 experiment tank, tank number 2. This is definitely looking like it's heavily planted. You might be thinking, why do you need to know how planted your tank is? Isn't it pretty obvious? And I think the answer to that is yes, but it can also be a little tricky, and here's why. If our Ancient Gardens tank over here didn't have Monte Carlo, and let's say it had Java moss on the trees, right? Then I would probably consider this a lightly planted tank. The Bamboo Aquarium is a lightly planted tank, in my opinion, although it has a really high nutrient demand because of this bamboo, and we've shown that in this by the fact that we've had livestock in it, we've put a lot of fish food in it, and we've never been able to detect any nitrates. That tells me that the demand for nitrate and probably a lot of other things that can over time make our water not good for our inhabitants is being dealt with by the bamboo and a little bit by the plant matter in here. And this is really the main point of understanding what kind of environment you have as far as plant mass and nutrient demand goes. It's important to classify what you have because it can help you when it comes to adding things like fertilizer, providing the right amount of CO2 if that's what you're into. It can also help you understand how much filtration capacity you're going to need on your tank. We've all seen aquariums, planted aquariums, that don't have filters. I have a few myself, and the reason why we can do that is because they're either heavily planted or they're medium or lightly planted but have a high demand for nutrients. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I was interested in coming up with a classification system for planted tanks relative to their biomass and their nutrient requirements. The overarching goal of that was to help people easily identify how much fertilizer they need to put in their tank, how much CO2, what kind of livestock they should put in their aquariums, all based on the relative bioload, plant mass. That system of determining whether you have a lightly, medium, or heavily planted tank starts with this. It starts with the bioload. So the bioload or biomass, however you want to think of it, of the plants in this tank that we're looking at right here is obviously really high relative to the volume of water, right? We see more plants than we do open water. That's the first step. If we come over here and look at this tank, which I called medium planted, we see it's less than 50-50, but there is a decent amount of plants in here. Same thing goes for the Ancient Gardens tank. There's a lot of open water in here. The ratio is definitely less than 50-50, but we have a relatively aggressive growing plant in here that's going to consume nutrients, and we'll talk about that in a second. Taking a peek at the Guppy Wine Glass, it has a lot of biomass. There's a lot of plants in here, but they're not super aggressively growing plants, so their demand for nutrients isn't going to be as high as, say, the plants over here. So it's really a two-step approach. First, look at the biomass relative to the water volume. If you have a lot of biomass and not as much open space or water in your tank, then you probably have a heavily planted tank. If your tank looks like this, pretty obvious that it's a lightly planted tank. The tricky part, and this is where the guesswork gets really hard and you have to just kind of figure it out as you go along, is the relative nutrient demand. So in a tank like this, it's medium planted, right? Or close to that. It's definitely not lightly planted, and it's definitely not heavily planted. So there's a gray area here, but the majority of the plants in this tank is that Monte Carlo. We're running CO2, so they have the velocity to grow, they want to grow. We add fertilizers, they consume it really fast because these plants are fast-growing aquarium plants. The same would also be true of this tank if we added CO2, like we did over in this one. nutrients would definitely help these plants grow faster. When you look on the bottle of pretty much any fertilizer that we commonly use these days, it's most likely an all-in-one, and they have a set of recommendations on the back for how much you should dose. If we added a recommended dose of pretty much any fertilizer to this tank, it might last a while because we have slow-growing plants and our biomass is relatively low. Whereas if we added that same dose, relative to the volume of course, in this tank, that fertilizer would probably go like that. So that's where understanding your plant's relative demand and bioload can help you make decisions in the things that you add to your tank or how you have your tank arranged and set up. If you have a tank that has a high plant load like this one, you're gonna probably have to add more fertilizer to get the results you want. That fertilizer is gonna get consumed very quickly in a tank that has a high biomass relative to a low one. Just because you have a lot of biomass and your tank is heavily planted like this one, doesn't mean you need to add fertilizers. Again, it's because the biomass in here is all relatively slow growing. We have Anubias, we have some Rotalas in here that are basically just in stasis mode, and this tank just doesn't require anything other than fish food and what these plants get from the substrate. Whereas this heavily planted tank could definitely benefit from some fertilizer. Imagine if the tank was half the height of all the biomass and we were growing to this point, adding some ferts and probably more ferts than what's recommended on a bottle would be beneficial to a system like this if that was our goal. The same thing can be said about CO2. If you're a CO2 guy, you know that the 30 parts per million is sort of like the Goldilocks amount. That's what we want to have in the tank. That's what we have in this tank, roughly. But I have run a lot of nano tanks in the past with lower amounts of CO2 just because I don't have super aggressively growing plants in them. An example could be this tank. This is a tank that I think would benefit from having CO2. Maybe not exactly 30 parts per million. That might be a little overshot just because the plants in here might not be able to handle that kind of a concentration. So this is a tank where I would experiment with trying like 10 or 20 ppms maybe and just seeing how it goes. I don't want this concept to be overly complicated. I could see how for a beginner it might seem like it's a lot, but I just want to mention the fact again that this is a lightly planted tank, but because we have some extras in here, the bamboo, that really suck up the nitrate, this is a lightly planted tank, but it doesn't really require anything special to do that. The point being that just because you have a lightly planted tank doesn't mean you don't need to add ferts and you don't need to have CO2. It's not all about the biomass, but more particularly, what type of biomass is it? What type of plants are they? Are they ones that have a high demand for nutrients, or are they ones like the Java fern that just kind of chill and do their thing? Here's another example of a lightly planted tank that we do add 30 parts per million roughly CO2 to, and we add a little bit of ferts to try and get this Monte Carlo to grow. So again, not all about biomass, but just know what you have. That's the whole point of this video. So yeah, guys, I just wanted to share that with you. Hopefully that helps somebody kind of wrap their mind around the different types of planted tanks you can have and how that's relative to the care. Hopefully it wasn't too overly confusing or anything. Just shooting this on a whim. I had the idea and I wanted to share it with you guys. So this tank, I just want to show off real quick. We got a bunch of baby shrimp down here hanging out, hiding in the algae from all the blue raspboras. There's some of the big mamas and daddies in here. Perfect excuse not to clean up the algae. If the shrimp needed to survive, we can let that hang out for a while, right? But yeah, anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and we'll see you in the next one. We're going to be putting something in here, and I'm excited for that. See you guys. you.